one of the ideas I had kicking around was like, if you think about organizations as an evolutionary species, maybe we just got a nervous system. And maybe now the information signals that this organism has access to opens up a possibility space which hasn't been explored that much when you used to use telephone calls or meetings or letters to organize a group of people. And so that idea was like, well, let's just experiment. Let's just play around.
Welcome to The Regeneration Will Be Funded. My name is Matthew Monahan, and in this series, we're exploring the intersections of regenerative finance, technology, and our living planet. Created with Ma Earth, you can find all of our conversations and more at maearth.com. Thanks for joining us. Hello and welcome. Today's conversation is with Joshua Weil from Enspiral. Josh is a bright mind, a natural educator, and an inspiration for many of us. I've been a part of the Enspiral community for several years and was also an angel investor in Enspiral Dev Academy, one of Josh's projects. We discuss themes like non-hierarchical organizing, capped returns, steward ownership. What has Josh so excited about the Web3 space, and what he thinks is even more important than decentralization in that field? Josh also goes into his views and feelings around climate change, whether he believes that the current systems and institutions are up for the task of our time, and finally, what have been some of the important ideas and influences on his journey. This conversation was recorded in Mangaroa, Aotearoa, New Zealand in March of 2023. I hope you get something from it. On to the show with Joshua Weil. Today we're here with Joshua Weil. Josh is a programmer and the founder of Enspiral. Thanks for being here, Josh.
Yeah, thank you. Excited.
Nice. So, Josh, you've had one of the most profound impacts on my personal journey of entrepreneurship, business, coming to New Zealand. So it is a real pleasure to have this conversation with you.
Oh, that's lovely to say.
So let's start from Enspiral. What is Enspiral and what was the journey and leading to that?
I'd say Enspiral, it's been on a few phases over the years. So it launched in about 2010 and it began life as a professional services cooperative, where essentially I got much more interested in social impact. And I'm a programmer, I was doing consulting work, and I started to, in the late thousands as a consultant, I could work for like 10 hours a week, and I spent the rest of my time volunteering on social change things. So I was doing climate change stuff, youth leadership stuff, just a whole bunch of things like, how do I turn my time into impact on this planet? I'd done some maths, and it was the 80,000 hours of hours left in my career if I had a full career. And I was just like, well, what's the best use of that time? And I think as a programmer, I just started to optimize it and do little slices. It was later I learned that was like a coping mechanism, because like when you stare into the belly of the beast of like global issues, it's pretty disheartening and really disempowering. And it's like, well, I'm not going to fix climate change, but maybe all I have to do is spend my 80,000 hours well. So I was just on this personal journey of like, how do I turn my time into something meaningful? And did a little bit of consulting and a lot of volunteering. And I saw a whole bunch of people who were really motivated to like, I really want to make a difference too. And a lot of people were constrained by their livelihood situations. So the thesis of Enspiral, like right at the beginning, was just like, can I help people who want to change the world get high-paid impact work or high-paid contract work so they can just be self-funded change makers and do whatever they want in terms of making a difference? And that's what got us started. So I turned my personal consulting company into a collective vehicle to help people do software development primarily. And we turned into a professional services cooperative in 2010.
And your tagline for a while was more people doing stuff that matters, right?
Yeah, more people working on stuff that matters. It still is. It's that idea that tagline's lasted the distance of the journey, because I'd say we've gone through 4 significant iterations or 5 over that time. But that idea of just the reason Enspiral exists is to help more people work on stuff that matters. And that there's a lot of like ambiguity about what matters and what people want to do. It's different to everyone, which means that it's a little bit of a hedge your bets kind of idea for impact entrepreneurs or people, in that, well, like I might be really interested in child poverty and you might be really interested in climate change. And maybe if I just take 4 hours a week or 5 hours a week and just help my peers succeed, because we really lent into this idea of mutual aid. And this is where we lent on a lot of the self-management work, a lot of the cooperative work. There was a lot of inspirations which led into it. And at its core, it's a case of, well, I could spend all my time on my venture or my project or my whatever it is. But if I just take a good chunk, some chunk of my time and spend it on my peers and just help them succeed however they need. Because some people, they need help with money, they need help with staff, they need help with just knowing who they are, they need rest. People need really different things. And when you have this community which is just focused on helping each other, then it kind of is like, we just want more people to work on stuff that matters. What matters is what matters to you. And it was an invitation-only community, and so we just had processes for people to join. It's pretty small, like we're about 100 odd people now. We don't think we've been over 200 people in the community, and a lot of those folks have launched different ventures over the time. And as I said, we've gone through phases where we're not a professional services cooperative anymore. That business shut down after 5 years, and now we're just a network of friends who help each other, make a difference in the world.
And in my mind, you were so early relative to most of the current technology space in terms of exploring the intersection between technology and organizing with these kind of cooperative, commons-based principles, mutual aid, but you were clearly drawing from lineages of work before. Curious, like, what have been some of your inspirations or frameworks or core ideas?
Yeah. I'd say as developers, open source influenced a lot of what we do. So they're just from the very beginning, like, let's work in the open. And it's not just like, let's share our software as open source code, but it's also like, let's spend the effort to publish our stories so that other people can hear those stories and, learn from them or not. So very much working in the open and sharing stuff was a big part of the lineage. I'd say that I'd run small businesses before. I'd had the experience of like being an employee or being a boss, and I didn't want either of them. Mm-hmm. So this was why self-management was in from the beginning. Like, how do we work without bosses? Non-hierarchical organizing. And I think at that time, my view was there was a real renaissance in self-management. There was a lot of people looking at management processes and saying, how do we actually organize differently? I was really influenced by Clay Shirky, Here Comes Everyone, and the idea of like, well, if you've got internet swarms, maybe the internet enables different forms of organisms and organizations. One of the ideas I had kicking around was like, if you think about organizations as an evolutionary species, maybe we just got a nervous system. And maybe now the information signals that this organism has access to opens up a possibility space which hasn't been explored that much when you used to use telephone calls or meetings or letters to organize a group of people. And so that was that idea was like, well, let's just experiment, let's just play around. But very much from the beginning, how do we work together as adults, and how do we avoid, I'd call like hierarchical traps, where people start to inhabit the position of parental figures or childlike figures. And to me, that's I learned a lot of just about the cultural aspects of how to work with people in that way and how to invite people to work in that way, because everyone comes in so conditioned. It's like we've all been children. We know what it's like to orientate in a world of powerful people who hide things from us and so on, and how to appease them and how to seek permission. And even if we haven't been parents, we've all observed a lot of parental type behavior. So it's very natural to like look after people and take away their choices and to hide scary things from them and to tell them stories to make them comfortable and to control and influence them in subtle and non-subtle ways. And that's so conditioned in people in organizing systems. It's really interesting when people show up to a new group. There's such an innate tendency of like, just show me who's in charge. I just want to find the person who's in charge and I want to orientate around who they are and how they are. And it's a really natural thing people do all the time. And as soon as you don't have someone in charge, it's really confusing for people to show up into a group.
And is that only cultural conditioning, or do you think that there's from an evolution perspective and from kind of like our animal instincts and tribal affiliations and so forth, that somehow that's really deeply ingrained in our behavioral tendencies?
I reckon it's conditioning. I think that there might be some ingrained stuff, but if you look at a lot of like deep human ingrained biological processes and needs, we've learned how to mitigate them and manage them in like civilization. And it's a case of, it's not just I'm hungry, so I'll hit someone over the head and take their apple. Like, we don't really do that, even if our biology might have made that okay in the past.
Right.
And so I think it's very much conditioning, because also I found it's not too hard to decondition people from that. It's like you just talk about adult and child and what it means to be an adult alongside other adults, and to how do you seek consent and not permission, and how do you start to be okay with differences of opinion, and how do you start to own your own stuff in a way. It takes a lot of personal development for people. But you can name that stuff pretty quickly, and people can explore a new possibility space relatively quickly, which is why I don't think it's hardwired. I think it's just a learned behavior.
Yeah, interesting. So, I mean, I feel like you're an interesting model for founders in that, one, I've never heard you say, like, I'm the CEO of Inspiral, and claim a title that most founders would just naturally start with. But also, I feel like, I've shared your name with people and they don't know who you are, but then you mention Inspiral and they know certainly what Inspiral is. And that's not common, right? For, founders to set so far back in the background and to let other people really shine, or to really prioritize the collective. And, I'm curious, like, what's been your personal journey of how to make those prioritizations real and tangible, and also, like, just practically speaking, like, how have you dealt with feelings of, like, hurt, or like not getting credit for something, or like feeling like you're over here working 80 hours a week and someone else takes credit, or like, I don't know, like, I'm just imagining that there's the inevitable like struggles associated with that, and I think that it'd be useful in my mind for other founders, and I've certainly had the benefit of learning from you, like, to just hear a little bit of your personal process.
Yeah, cool. It turns out that if you call yourself the CEO of a non-hierarchical organization, the experiment might not work out as well. There's something about it's just those two things don't gel with each other. But it was a super intentional choice. And one of it was because I wanted to be part of a community of peers. And that means being a peer, not being a pseudo peer or a pretend peer, but actually a boss or so on. And the other thing is that when you look at self-organizing or cooperatives or different things, and people often talk about like flat hierarchical structures, people often feel like what they want is everyone has equal power and equal voice, which is A, impossible, and two, I don't think optimal, in that it's impossible for everyone to have equal power and equal voice because of the way humans work and reputation works, etc. And so often what I think about in organizations is, how do you design something which has power contours, but it has smooth power contours, and it has ones where you've intentionally chosen where the hills are and so on. And so often on a practical level, the way that because if I look at Inspiral, like, it used to be my personal company, I personally interviewed the first 300 people we worked with, just one-on-one. This is Inspiral. This is how you join. This is what you want to do. I was a gatekeeper for people coming in. And if I had stopped doing work at any stage, the thing just would have stalled. No one would have cared enough for it to keep going. And to go from what I would call a very founder-centrist organization, which is what I think the first year and two was that was the bootstrapping Inspiral phase, to the next phase, which took another 2 years, where I started to call myself the ex-founder of Inspiral, until I realized that confused people and I thought I'd quit. And it was really hard to communicate. It was really hard to say, I am no longer operating in that mode. I'm operating in a mode of a peer alongside everyone else. And sure, a lot of people know me, so I have a bit more reputation, so I might have a bit more influence. But some of the things I did was I made it so that legally I had no more influence or interest in the organization. So because Inspiral is a not-for-profit foundation, that meant that there was no worries about who has shares and how much money and wealth do people get out of this thing. It was just, we just locked it all away and gave it to the commons. The other one was legally I made it so that, well, I'm just a shareholder and I have one share and other people have one share. So I actually had no legal power over my peers. And so that was the first thing. Because if either of them hadn't been done, I wouldn't have been able to step out of that role. And the rest of it was really noticing the power contours and noticing, how do you consciously decentralize money, information, and control? And every time it felt like only I knew something and other people didn't, I had to document it and share it and get other people to create it. Whenever people started to seek consent from me or permission from me to do things, then I would avoid that situation and say, well, actually, what do you think you should do? And how do you get consent from, like, ask people, you'll get the mandate from the organization, not from me saying, yes, you should do this. And the same with access to finances. So I often thought about it as, like, if the organization is a web, whenever it had a knot of something, then you just massage it and you relax it and you want it to be an easeful, smoother sort of contour. That's how I practically became the ex-founder of Inspiral. In terms of the personal journey, it's like there's a whole, what is it? Is it Fight Club? The things you own end up owning you. And I think that's true for so many founders' experiences. Like, you own a piece of the company, right? Do you really? Doesn't that company own you? Isn't it like you put yourself in a situation where the only logical thing is for you to sacrifice everything else in your life apart from this thing? And I think that chaining themselves to ventures is what the consequence of a lot of people's choices of, like, having their reputation tied up with it or having their wealth tied up with it. And so I just decided not to do that in this venture. With Inspiral in particular, it was like I did this work because I wanted a community of peers to help me out and I could help out. And that's just been, I'm so grateful I made that decision because, it's still kicking now. And as I'm going for a new work transition phase, I'm leaning into that community and I've got all these friends who I've worked with for ages. And it's just a really comforting way to orientate in the world, to have quite a close-knit collective of folks who I see frequently or infrequently. And I just love it.
Yeah, it sounds like there's a lot of advantages to that liberation of not being owned and fully identified only with our projects, but also that peer relationship being such a natural corollary to lifelong friends and people with mutual respect and, not feeling just this weight of managerial responsibility, but actually that you're empowering the people around you and that you're getting empowered by them. And that I'm curious with the softening of power contours, how much of this is also that the hierarchical nature of expertise and reputation and like where power does exist, maybe hierarchical is the wrong word. How much of that is fluid based on context specific? Like, are we trying to design organizations that are flocks of starlings where it's just like we keep kind of waving through, or is it that it's a more traditional, static? Like, I feel like hierarchies in current corporate form are so enshrined. CEO, VP of this, da-da-da-da. But then like so many of the decisions are actually more attuned to different experts within the organization at different times. And yet this kind of static pyramid can be a bit unwieldy. I'm curious your thoughts on this in the context of Inspiral.
I just think there's trade-offs. Well, one is I think organizational structure should fit the context. And so in Spiral, we're a club. We don't. Doesn't have much money flowing through it. It's just a group of people who share a brand and connect with each other and help each other out. So it's kind of like a low stakes organization. It's not like we've raised a bunch of money and people's livelihoods and houses are on the line, etc. So that immediately by being in that context, it takes away some tensions that would be there in a different context. And I think the other one is around like, what's the purpose of the organization? And it's like, if you take, for example, a typical hierarchical culture of like highest paid person in the room's opinion. I've heard that called a hippo sort of thing, where it's just like, cool, we're sitting around a table. Oh, we don't know what to do. Who's paid the most here? Okay, what do they think? Okay, let's orientate around them. And again, you can see some downsides to that, but you can also see some upsides to it around in terms of like just getting things done quickly and might not be the best decision, but it's a decision and you move forward. And so it's just, I just think there are trade-offs for every single piece of organizational design that you do. And that it's really about choosing the trade-offs that are appropriate for the people and the mission and the context of the thing. And that's why I think org design is such an interesting field that lots of people are jumping into and exploring in the DAO space and others is just how do we design our organizations and when do you do the way someone else does it and when do you do it your way and how do you communicate that with new people who are just used to there being one way of working, etc. So it's that I think is the nature of it.
Got it. And Inspiral's now reaching, there's global chapters and members all over the world, but it had its roots in Aotearoa, New Zealand. I'm curious your reflections on the uniqueness of this place for incubating that kind of project, or how much did it shape the culture? And any commentary about New Zealand as an incubation place for this type of work?
I'd go a bit further and say it was Wellington in 2009, 2010. Because it was that particular city in that context where I was having the experience of like, oh, I'd like to work with some colleagues and so on. And there was no co-working spaces then. It's like, I don't even think Facebook was that big. Like I remember the groups I was on before, it was like people using Ning to organize stuff. And it was like, there's this, it was pre-Slack and so on. We used Yammer for a couple of years. It's like there was this time where organizing tools were a bit less ubiquitous. And there was no kind of social enterprise scene. There was no kind of social enterprise funding or whatnot. So I think in that context, a bunch of people just bootstrapping like, well, let's just help each other is kind of a logical thing. Like people starting mutual credit circles when there's no banking infrastructure. And so I think that time was a part of it. On the New Zealand context, it's like far away from everywhere. So there was definitely a little bit more of the helping each other makes a bit more context there. So I say in a low resources, not much happening in this space. It's a bit new, but it's a bit you hear about on the internet. You don't see it in your street. That's what I see as part of the influence of it. On some of our gatherings, gatherings practices, because a big part of Inspiral has been 6 monthly retreats. And we get together and we have these immersive retreats, and it's a key part of how we work. They're quite transformative. a bunch of those gathering practices, you can trace their lineage back to the way Māori gathered in different places. There's the people who I learned that from, who learned it from someone else and so on. I've seen the ways that, and again, they've morphed over that time. I wouldn't say that they are handed down, clearly and whatnot, but it's more like people have an experience. They said that was a good experience. When I'm gathering, I might do something similar to it, and a couple of iterations of that, and it's in our hands as a bunch of young entrepreneurs and programmers, and we're using these tools and these spaces and social protocols in a fairly, what would you say, improvised ad hoc way. And so that's definitely some, I say, influence from New Zealand.
And Māori, of course, being the indigenous people of Aotearoa, New Zealand. Yeah, fascinating. So at the annual or semi-annual gatherings, what are some of the specific social technologies that you've learned and picked up on? I know you and the Inspiral community have been a source for a lot of other communities in New Zealand to do different simple things. Like I know, we were just at dinner last night and people were all like trying to get everyone's attention and raising their hands. And I know we all picked that up from Inspiral, where it was like, if you're in a group of people and you just put your hand up, shut your mouth, and other people do it, and then all of a sudden the whole room goes quiet, and it's like this collective intelligence mechanism for getting attention. And like, I'm curious, some of these other little tidbits, and maybe you could talk a bit about open space as well.
So I'd say you can probably trace the lineage of that one back to kindergartens. I think it's kindergarten teachers who taught someone who taught us that, and again, it's super useful. I use it in any event I facilitate.
We're all conditioned as children.
I'd say a lot of it comes down from the work of Billy Matheson. So he does a lot. He does trainings on hosting now and gathering, and all of my personal facilitation and hosting stuff I've learned by watching him and his spaces. And so it was him who taught me open space. And I can't remember the people who invented that in the first place, but just it's a formal thing you can do in conferences. So I'd say every gathering we've done from the beginning all the way through now, open space has been a big part of it. I would say that kicking off with just check-in rounds and connecting as people outside of the work, and closing with checkouts of connecting with people outside of the work is like in connecting to each other as humans and just spending time together is the key thing. One of the things I've often thought about is using physical gatherings to establish relationships and using online communications between gatherings to maintain them. Because I've seen a lot of people or groups where they do these amazing gatherings and then there's a breath and then you're at the next one 6 months later or a year later, and there's just not much reason to spend time with each other in between. And with Inspiral being a very livelihood-focused endeavor, you've got work opportunities to do where maybe you get work for someone, you do a contract with someone, because then you are getting paid to spend time with people and maintain their relationship. So it was a very intentional social design from the beginning. But so check-ins, check-outs, open spaces, good food, and then having like usually a party night and then usually like a story circle night. We hold a bit more of a quiet space for people to really share stories with each other that are meaningful to them. That's kind of the retreat. It's a really simple format, but it's and we've tried lots of things over the years, and those are the bits that if I was hosting a gathering, I'd just start to lean on those key parts of it.
I remember when I went to an Inspiral gathering when I was still living in California, and I came out to New Zealand, and I was challenged by the level of patience that it required to sit in a circle, and I just wasn't used to it.
Yeah,
and I just didn't have a lot of circle experience, and I was really having to kind of go in and be like, is this the most optimal, productive way of spending time? Or am I just being impatient? Or is this just like a group of hippies that are going to talk in a circle all the time? Like I was just having this like whole experience. And I think over time, what I've, it's that if you want to go far, go slower, whatever that quote is. I think Inspiral has proven this degree of endurance and lifelong relating between the network and a lot of the core folks, because there is that human to human level connection and more legitimacy in the community because of the way it's inclusive of all of its voices. And I'm curious of those trade-offs in getting things done. And how that kind of circle format is so central to a lot of these ideas, and yet. Sometimes the hierarchical entrepreneur in me just wants to be like, no, you do this, you do that, let's go.
Yeah, and it's just, again, it's different trade-offs. It's like if you try and do a circle with 200 people, everyone will have that experience and walk away. Like it'll take you 4 hours and it's just not worth it. And so a lot of it, and this is where I think so much of organizing depends on the size of it as well. The stuff you're doing with 12 people, you can't do with 50. And vice versa. Like maybe there are some things that rhyme, but they're different layers of organizing. And also I'd say that when you look at the history of like cooperatives and mutuals and groups going back decades, a lot of them have had experience sitting in circle. And there's an attitude which works when you're sitting in circle with people. And there's a skill set needed. And there's also things you should sit in circle about, and there's things you shouldn't sit in circle about. Again, should and shouldn't being very contextual views. But I would use that technique with intention rather than just, you just always sit in circle and always talk about things. It's a little bit like different decision-making techniques. If you're having a consent-based decision where it takes someone to actively block to stop it versus an advice process versus a delegated authority versus who's included, who's not, all of those things I find are often where the rubber hits the road when it comes to org design things. And you can make choices and they've got trade-offs and you're naming the main trade-off of like, as soon as you engage more people, it goes slower. And is that a good use of everyone's time and attention? And I think this is really true in governance work and DAOs and whatnot. It's like if everyone spends all their time debating what is a DAO and how does it work, well, what have you got done? And if you've also got a lot of people who are doing meta-governance work rather than the actual work, is that an inefficient use of resources? And if you just delegate it to one person, then it's probably not going to get you an optimal decision and output. And I think it's all about how do you break things up and how do things relate to each other and what's appropriate there. It's just like a fascinating puzzle.
Interesting. Okay, great. Reflecting back on this, what's now 13-year plus journey with Enspiral, what are some of the mistakes that come to mind?
Mistakes.
Regrets, key lessons.
I mean, in the first 5 years, I'd say I was so new to this form of organization that a lot of the ways I just showed up was like, I just wouldn't do that again. And whether it's like trying to, I wouldn't say beat a decision out of the network. That's probably too strong a language, but it's a case of like being a little bit more forceful than I would now to try and get to a decision. When I'm like, now I'd be like, that decision doesn't matter. We don't need to burn our relationships with each other to get this. Whereas early on, I was like, if we don't get a decision on this, like we're toast. And so I think I had a bit more too much. I didn't realize how resilient this form of organization was earlier on. So I was a bit more precious about how things had to be in certain ways. And I worked really hard on some things there. I've one of the biggest things that, I don't know if it's a mistake, but a learning has been that there's a lot of things that a group of people want to exist and that will kind of get nudged into existence without the person who really cares about it, and they will fail. So we had a co-working space for many years because everyone wanted a co-working space. No one wanted to run the thing. No one wanted a co-working space business. And so it was just this orphaned project which had people who were just like, I'll take one for the team, stepping into it repeatedly, and then eventually we shut it down. And so it's like, now I have a lot more respect for like, who cares about this thing? Who's really going to drive this thing? Now it is going to exist, rather than like the community needs something, who's going to take a hit for them, would be some of the things early on. A whole bunch of like, learnings of, okay, how many people do we need to be involved in this? Like our initial agreements that we wrote. So we wrote a handbook in about 2012, 13, and that lineage has continued. And that was we were too prescriptive of our agreements. They were too fragile. It's like writing law that's too detailed rather than at the right level of abstraction. So I've learned a lot about how to write the right level of agreements that will last the test of time. But the big mistakes overall, I think it's like, every time there was a network killing thing, where we've gone through probably 3 or 4 of them, people have stepped up and responded, and we have shifted the shape of the organization. And so overall, like I feel like the mistakes that we've made, we've noticed and corrected, and so that we're in this new phase now of sort of multi-node communities, etc.
So would it be fair to say that this kind of more resilient form of organizing, part of its resilience is because it's adapting and living and adjusting to its different phases and chapters?
Yeah, and I think that's true of any organization, right? Like if you look at any organization that's been around for 10 years, it's probably done a lot of adapting and it's probably got some resilience to it. But I think particularly for mutual aid, non-hierarchical type organizations, the biggest threat to them is that no one cares about it. It's like, oh yeah, that's a cool thing, I'm just not going to pay attention anymore, and it will just fade away. And it's when, as soon as there are heated arguments in Enspiral about how it should be, it kind of doesn't matter what the outcome is, because people care and people are putting energy into this thing that they have a relationship with, which ties me back to that original question you had of like, how did it feel being a founder in that thing? one really powerful learning for me was around social constructs, where often I've seen people show up to Inspiral, the community, they have an experience, and they're like, Inspiral let me down. Or Inspiral hurt me. There's no such thing as Inspiral. It's just a group of people. Like there is that logo, that name. It's just something we use as a shorthand. But there is no thing. It's impossible for Inspiral as a thing that doesn't exist. And so there's so much of the dynamics I've seen emerge in community come because of these social constructs or because of the narrative we have about what happened. And if we control that narrative, then we have very different experiences, or I have a very different experience in community. And so for me, that's one of the biggest learnings has been, how do I actually pay attention to the right things and not just make up stories in my head about what's going on as it relates to, all the dynamics of working with people.
Got it. So one of those next iterations for you in your career was to then focus on Inspiral Dev Academy. Can you share a bit about what is Inspiral Dev Academy, or EDA?
Yeah, sure. So this was off the back of the professional services phase or cooperative kind of vibe. We had a lot of people show up, and it turns out not many of them wanted to stay in professional services. Most people using that as a means of an end until they could start a venture and whatnot. And so the venture that I started with a colleague was Dev Academy, which was a programming bootcamp. And so now we actually renamed to Dev Academy Aotearoa a couple of years ago. And this name's something that I also think is also interesting in Inspiral, is that at the beginning, we thought the more people use the Inspiral brand, the better. Let's use it for Inspiral Accounting, Inspiral Legal, Inspiral Space, Inspiral this and that. And it turns out that's just confusing. People would use the word Inspiral and not know what the hell they were talking about. And so because we weren't really aligned and no branding message and whatever, rookies. But anyway, that's so when we had this decision of like, well, we're just a network of people, we started to, all the ventures gave Inspiral back. So they stopped using it in their name. And Dev Academy was the last one to do it, which took a while because we were slow to organize some things. So there are now no more Inspiral branded ventures. But yeah, it's a programming bootcamp. We licensed a curriculum off Dev Bootcamp in the US. And so I went over there and saw how they were doing things. So 2014, I think we did our first cohort. So helping people quit careers and become software developers. And it's really just about like, how can you help people improve their livelihoods? And it's a straight help people get better jobs kind of education initiative. My reflections on that it turns out in New Zealand, when you have the government giving student loans for education and so on, if you're outside the system, you've got a real headwind. So we survived outside the system for ages because TEC would not fund short courses. And it's like TEC is the Tertiary Education Commission, and they are essentially, like I think they spend maybe 6 billion New Zealand dollars procuring tertiary education for the country. So they pay all the universities, the polytechs and everyone, and they're kind of like a government procurement agency. And if they give you a subsidy as an educator, then the government will by default give student loans available to those people. So we didn't really care so much about the subsidy from the government, but it mattered a whole lot if students could get loans to study with us because it was an expensive, intensive course. And so one of the things in that journey was, I think at some stage, so at the very beginning, we're like talking to TC and they're saying, no, we just don't fund short courses. If it's not a year long, we don't do it. And we're like, the whole point of this is it's less than a year long because if you're a career switcher who wants to take a year out of work. And so we just started doing our thing and having success and getting people work, and some people noticed it. And I think like a productivity commission wrote a report about, hey, this works. And all after that report, all of a sudden TEC is like, oh yeah, we'll fund short courses. And it was just seeing how a change in policy made possible a different form of organization or a different form of education. So it was a really interesting interplay of like, as a publicly funded, a semi-publicly subsidized educator in New Zealand, you've got your customers, the students, you've got their employers as a stakeholder, and you've got the government. And those three parties need to work to marry up and to run this sort of education course. So it's just fascinating to see that type of thing going in. And personally, I just loved teaching, like just being hands-on. I feel like I got funnier every year. Maybe it's just my perspective.
I mean, I've watched you go from kind of founder, entrepreneur, programmer archetype to really owning this educator archetype. And, you know, I would see you and you would just be gushing with students' lives who you were watching be changed and how many students were enrolled in the latest course. And it seemed like you derived a lot of excitement and passion from it. How has that part of the journey been in terms of occupying this role as an educator?
So rewarding. Like I'd say anyone who's got a career or profession or whatnot, if you get the opportunity to spend some of your time teaching, do it. I've just found it's like I have fallen more in love with programming because of teaching it to people. And also the art of education is fascinating in its own right. People have studied a lot about how do you effectively help people acquire skills. And it's a really fascinating domain. And it's just such a human experience of just like, you get to watch people get better step by step really rapidly, and the impact that can have on their lives is massive. And so it's like, once you've helped your like 20th coffee shop worker get a job as an engineer in a tech company, and seeing the impact on their lives and seeing the impact on the economy, it just starts to stack up and aggregate. It's a lot of work and it's a hard grind, but once you start to see the impact stacking up, it's just really safe impact bets. Like, no matter what else happens in my career, I know there's X hundred of people that I have helped to change their lives. And also when you look at education as a whole, like we've had teachers who've gone out into like the university experience and they say, oh, it's not the same. And there's a lot of education environments which I would say don't excite me that much. But when you start to really focus on like whole of person education and life-changing experiences, on one hand, learning programming and getting jobs, it's just an excuse to get people in a room together. But if you get them in a room for like 9-12 weeks, you can start to create an experience which is deeply life-changing for people. And I find that really mirrors my experience with Inspiral, where Inspiral, if I think about it from a numbers point of view, it's like I directly helped a few hundred people. And directly I was a part of helping them. A lot of them, lots of other people helped them as well. And maybe, 30, 40, 50 of them, I'd say are really dear friends today. And I'm still in a relationship with, and it's a really lovely, tight-knit, comfortable community. Whereas with Dev Academy, it was a bit more institutionalized. It was a bit more like, here's a cohort, we're starting. The numbers were bigger. I remember less of those people. I'm in a relationship with less of those people, but I feel like it was still life-changing impact on them. And so it's kind of, when you look at global issues, it's like, a drop in the water. But it's just a really, comforting and satisfying thing. It's a little bit like, I really enjoy chopping firewood at the moment. And it's just every time I've done a chop of firewood, the stack's just a little bit taller. And I just feel a little bit happier because of it. It's this innate striver in me just likes to see things growing. It's like why I like growing potatoes and so on. It's just that you plant some potatoes and then there's heaps more in like 3 months is just a miracle and amazing. And you get to eat them and give them away and so on. And and so I find I reflect on both Inspiral and Dev Academy as very satisfying chunks, but also it was 10 years and I learned a lot in the time. And it's just I feel like I'm content, and also I'm ready for the next thing.
And before we get to the next thing, I just a couple other questions about Dev Academy or observations. I mean, one theme that's come out in this interview series so far is this need to point to use cases of purposeful organizations that are also successful at being sustainable and standing on their own feet. And that's been my experience with Dev Academy. Full disclosure, I'm an early small angel investor. And so I've gotten to watch the journey from that perspective as well. And you made the math work, right? And yet, you were always very generously giving as an entity scholarships to underserved or underprivileged communities to bring them into the teaching. You were always, I think, just approaching it like it could have been a nonprofit from the outside. It didn't feel like it had this fierce commercial intent that was charging a huge amount of money for its courses or anything like that. But I mean, the model just fundamentally worked. And I'm curious, just your reflections on that.
I'd say that Dev Academy, like it's 3 or 4 organization killing things which went our way. When if they'd gone the other, we wouldn't be there. So a lot of luck and fortune. It feels like we threaded a needle a little bit where the organization has got impact ground into its DNA. Like it's just, I have very little concern about mission drift with Dev Academy. It's just who we are and how we are. And growing the organization person by person, I feel really comfortable with that. So I'm not too concerned about will Dev Academy sell out or whatnot? It's like, not with any of those folks running it. And also it's a case of you can build profitable businesses being education when you've got public subsidies in the mix and you've got a premium sort of course out there. It's a possible business model. It's a tough one. So we have made the numbers work in this instance, but it's been a sort of tough ride. I would say that a big influence for me on like commercial structure of startups and social enterprise and whatnot, it was actually a fellow in SOCAP I met like 2011, 12, not sure. Looney Libes does Fledge. And he was the first person who started talking, I don't know what he called it, maybe cap returns is what I called it, but it was just the idea of when private investors put money into a company, maybe they don't own it forever. Maybe they get some money out of it, but one day they stop getting money out of it and the thing goes on a public goods, not for profit, spend the money on impact sort of thing. And just the story he was telling about like how much money the Ford Motor Company investors made and how much it returned in dividends over its first 20 years, and how ridiculous it was that it just kept pumping out dividends to private people after that, was just this, like, I think that's where inequality comes from in our society, is unconstrained returns on capital in publicly controlled companies. And on one hand, that also funds a whole bunch of people's retirements and pension funds. So it's like there are trade-offs and it's not an easy thing. But that was enough of a story for me to say, well, if I'm building a company which is privately owned, I don't want it to be privately owned forever. I want it to transition at some stage so that it is owned for the public good. And so we've had that intention since the beginning of it, and maybe it'll work. Like I'd say if building a financially successful, sustainable social enterprise is threading a needle, I think getting it so that people who've invested money or invested time are paid out appropriately, and appropriately is a very, people could have different views on it. But there's some point where they no longer get any more money out, and then it's essentially owned as a foundation or a charity. I think that's threading the needle twice over. So my hope is we can do it. It's still on our game plan. We're still trying to do it, but it's also not done.
Yeah, I would just really highlight that, because I still don't hear as much about capped returns as I think is deserving of the power of that concept, where, if I, as an investor, put money in, I'm not just entitled to infinite perpetual dividends and equity appreciation, but that there's some sort of cap on, okay, after you've made your whatever, 2x, 5x, 10% per annum, whatever the mechanism is to cap the return, then the rest is actually value that can go back into commons pool resourcing and or graduate the organization into a charitable structure or some sort of for public good structure. And yeah, if we did that with all of the first or second generation of internet and technology companies, could you imagine what the world would look like now? I mean, rather than the issues we currently face with Google and Facebook and Netflix and whatnot, like, what if they were all community owned? How would that be, and those investors would have still made off handsomely, right? And it seems like still a bit of an unproven concept at scale, right?
A little bit. I'd say that, so capped returns as a phrase, haven't seen much there. Steward ownership, I've seen a lot more around. And if you look at examples like Bosch, are steward owned, and they did that kind of deal in the 40s or the 50s when the founder passed away. And a foundation owns that company. And so I feel like looking into the steward ownership stuff, you'll see longer term examples of it. But also it hasn't really taken off as a virus in a way. It's not like lots of people do their capital structures there. And on one hand, you can understand, because from a commercial point of view, an uncapped return is more valuable than a capped one. So that you can understand why people make that choice. Even if they're managing funds for impact, they're still like, well, why would I, you're deferring the decision of how those funds will be spent to this unknown organization, as opposed to your organization where you can put in safeguards and whatnot. So I can understand little bits of it. And also I see the potential for, well, if you just sort of contract in the capped returns piece of it, and you could start to snowball. You could start to have funds who can only invest in capped return structures. And if that capital pool can outcompete other capital pools, you could see this methodology transforming finance over the long term. That was what got me excited about it initially. And I was like, oh, maybe I'll really help try and make capped returns a thing. And lots of people do it. And I don't know. And I don't know if that's my work to do. But it is, I like structuring my vehicles that way. And I think there's an interesting idea in it. Because the other thing I've noticed on the Dev Academy journey has been that whenever you're growing a private company and you get up to like 50 staff or 5 to 10 mil turnover or whatnot, all these people start showing up on LinkedIn, and they often look like private equity folks who are like, we specialize in equity getting founders, and we'll do quick deals, and it's like, and you can make some money and pay off your house, and it's just, and they flick your company to a publicly traded entity in 3 years and whatnot, and you corporatize it and do all these things to it you probably wouldn't do. And there's just this whole raft of an ecosystem, which I don't see for social enterprises and impact things. There's no one I can think about who would do a deal for a capped returns company at the moment, because when you look at ecosystem things, recycling founders into their next ventures is something that for-profit startups have done very well. And they've started to really effectively get the people who are up for doing a venture again on that track, or people who are up for doing the investing thing on that track. And I haven't seen as much of that in the impact space. And again, it might just be my perspective in New Zealand and just who I know. Maybe it's really alive and healthy elsewhere. And I think there's merit to it, because when I look at my personal journey, I've started to realize things like, I don't want to invest. I don't want to steward capital. I don't want to have the like philanthropy or investment sort of thing. That's not the work that it lights me up. And, do I want to do more ventures? Yeah, I wouldn't mind doing more ventures, but at some stage I'm going to have a sabbatical for a bit. And it's just a really interesting situation to be in, and stewarding Dev Academy on its journey. And so one of the ideas I have been kicking around is like, I know a few social enterprises in New Zealand who are banding together to basically, how do we start exiting the capital from it? How do we start to do this? How do we start to recycle founders, et cetera? So maybe I'll try and be in community with people like that. But I think there is an opportunity, I think, for people focused on, if anyone is like, hey, I want to grow capped returns and whatnot, I would start to look at, if you look at the deal that like the Patagonia founders did, where they've got a very big, very successful company, and they're just happy to give most of it away. And that when you reach like $1 billion valuations and whatnot, those sorts of deals, there are people who make that choice. But I think there's a whole bunch of companies in like the 10 to 100 million range where there are founders who will probably exit to a charitable entity with like a 50 to 80% discount on it.
Right.
And it's like, because if I look at what I would start to do with the Dev Academy over the different things, it's like, yeah, I don't really want to take a lot of capital out of that. I'd be happy to give that to any kind of impact organization, so long as that I can, make it so I've got a bit of optionality on my time, etc. I reckon there are a lot of impact founders, I reckon there are some impact founders out there who are building organizations who are like, yeah, I'm tired of this. I'm ready to do something else. I'm ready for a sabbatical. I'm ready for my next thing. And that there might be a class of impact capital which can help recycle them faster. Anyway, someone should do that.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I mean, what I'm hearing is that there's an opportunity for founders to try to bring this into the zeitgeist more and to bake in some sort of capped returns, steward-owned is what you said?
Yeah, steward ownership. I've seen Purpose Capital using that
Purpose
phrase.
Capital structure, especially if an entrepreneur has an oversubscribed deal or has some negotiation leverage. And then there's also an opportunity probably for more traditional, venture or folks in the impact investing space to carve out a bit of a niche and say, we support this model, because then that will bring, talented founders who are trying to structure their organizations this way, potentially into alignment with them, and they can win deals. But then you're also describing, a fairly radical notion of like endowments and foundations starting to become acquirers of like social enterprises. And maybe there's economic terms that really make sense for both sides. And that would be super interesting, where then you have the spillover into philanthropic structures and, the right kinds of stewardship and values-driven organizations.
Like, assuming you can get the numbers right, and assuming you can find founders who will exit for like 80% haircuts or whatnot, which my gut feel is there's probably some deals like that out there, then you could imagine that being a very effective use of capital for a philanthropist, as long as you're getting businesses which will last the test of time, that the valuations are correct and so on. Maybe that could snowball very quickly. And because when I think about cap returns as a model, and I think about how could it actually outcompete, or how could it be a viable, bigger pool of capital, is if it can start to have some kind of unfair advantage.
Right.
And that's where I think about maybe it's the founders who just don't really want to exit with lots of money and then have the problem of giving it away or managing it, etc., and who just want modest amounts. But you get that if you can attract and train and grow that class of founder in an ecosystem play, I reckon that pool, that community could capture a whole bunch of value and just ensure it's locked in for the public good for a good chunk. So I don't know. And again, this is the sort of ideas I play around with. And it's like, is that a venture I've got in me one day? Will I try and do that? I don't know. I'm not sure if it plays to my strengths and whatnot. And I think there's a really interesting idea. I just keep kicking around in my head.
Yeah, well, that's part of the reason I was excited to interview you, because you're the kind of person where you probably forget more ideas than most of us ever have. And I think that someone just needs to kind of transcribe and document some of these concepts and then run with it. So you mentioned this transition that's kind of underway with your work with Dev Academy. And so what's next?
Oh, I have no idea. Part of it is having a bit of a break and just exploring things. I think I'm at this, because a lot of it, some things I've learned about myself is when an organization hits 30, 40, 50 people, I don't really want to be managing that organization. And I would like teams of 5 or 12 people. I really like messing around with protocols for decentralized systems, whether it's human systems or computer systems. And so I'm really enjoying the phase of Inspiral at the moment, where we've basically done the governance work to make small communities possible. So we've got 3 sub-communities kicking around, and we've built the framework for other people to start their own. So I'm launching an Inspiral DAO, and it's tiny. It's 13 people. And it's like, but it's how do we take the stuff that's worked in Inspiral, and how do we borrow and copy the stuff that's working in the DAO space, and how do we just mess around with that organizational form? And so looking at seasons and looking at how do you, when you make, because we've made agreements in Inspiral since the beginning, but if your agreement is designed to be implemented on chain, what different choices will you make? And how can you start to make the right level of trade-offs for, remote collaboration or for global participation? And how can you start to just, look at what the DAO folks are doing and manage an on-chain treasury, etc. So, and that's a small hobby project I'm definitely putting some time into and quite excited about. And I think a lot of it is like, I've realized I'm a builder. I like to make, whether it is physical things or growing potatoes or chopping firewood or writing code, I want to be making things. And so I've been doing a lot more coding stuff. I dived into like a holochain coding intensive over the last weekend, and I've got a hackathon starting tomorrow morning. And so I'm just excited to be playing with this agent-centric tech system. It's very alien to me, coming from like, Web 2 and also from, EVM sort of structures. And so that's just, it's a different way of coding and thinking. And I'm just really interesting to that.
Can you share more about that? I mean, I think holochain is still relatively fringe in the crypto world. And what do you think about holochain? What's attracting you to that?
So I'd say they just hit their beta now. So it's really immature. It's like, people have been building on it for a while now. It's been a slow burn to get up to the beta. But it is, the things which got me attracted to it was, I felt like the values of the people starting it were very aligned with the things I cared about. They had a deep sort of history around like mutual cooperation, and there was no sense of like it's just a culture of value creation and peer production in a way. And so that just, the people involved in that project, I feel very aligned with culturally. And I've got friends who started to work for them, etc. And the technical choices they've made, it feels like when I think about Web 2, it's like you have a server, someone's got the keys to it. It's very efficient. It's very cheap. It's probably as cheap as you can get in terms of an information system, as long as people aren't extracting rents from it. But conceptually, it's a very cheap thing. And when you look at blockchains with big consensus, it's very expensive. Every bit of compute is super expensive because tens of thousands of other people are double checking it. And there's a lot of stuff, even with proof of stake, it's still like the compute's expensive because it's staked by a whole bunch of capital. And so that's super expensive, but it also gives you a root source of legitimacy in society because you're not being underwritten by a government or force or something like that. So it's expensive, but it gives you legitimacy. And I feel like Holochain have got this situation where it is like censorship resistant, but it is much cheaper than that thing. So it opens up this application space, and maybe you can lend in. So it's kind of, I think of it a little bit like layer 2 sort of stuff, but it's just a very different way of doing it with like agent-centric sort of things.
And what does that mean, agent-centric?
So I would describe it as, if you think about biology and organisms and the cells in the leaves of the tree or whatnot, then each of those cells doesn't know about the other ones. It's not in relationship to those other ones. It just knows about its world. It's an agent, and it's got its inputs and its outputs, and it responds to it. So there is no chain with a global state that you can read. In Holochain, it's like you're an agent and you can see partial bits of the state. And then other bits of the state are managed by someone else, and you never see them in general. Maybe you can go find them, but also they've got this concept of there's private data and public data. So some data you can't get access to. And they've got these validation rules of how can you ensure people are playing fair in this system if you can't read the whole chain. So it relies a lot on trust and peers validating peers and other people will have checked their work. And so it's this really interesting different paradigm of like, there is no global state I can read. I can't just look at the total amount of XYZ that's there. And so agent-centric programming is the term that they use in it. And it's just fascinating. And the way they use hash tables. So I just feel like they've made this really interesting trade-offs to make a larger space where I can build more stuff in it than I could store on-chain. So I don't have to do like an on-chain, off-chain hybrid as much. You can just store it in the Holochain ecosystems. And also I can see ways that it can plug into both of those ends. So it's easy to get Web 2 apps plugging into Holochain apps. And it's easy to get Web or like EVM or heavy consensus apps plugging into Holochain apps. Or easy, possible, because it's all beta and everyone's just building stuff. So as a technologist, I'm just excited by it. And hey, Holochain people, if I've messed that up, sorry. I don't know your system that well.
Yeah, we're all learning together. Yeah, I'm sure they'll appreciate the shout out. And we'll put links to Holochain in the show notes as well. So you've got Inspiral DAO experiments emerging. You've got, you did for Dev Academy, as I understand, a bit of a Web3 programming course and some different programming Am I correct on
I
that?
started a crypto coding club.
You started a crypto coding club, and,
So I just did a bunch
and
of
now
stuff.
you're also doing hackathons for Holochain. And so it sounds like Web3 and crypto has your attention in some fundamental ways. And given the landscape of all the things you can do and the limited numbers of tens of thousands of hours to do it, like why Web3 crypto? What's emerging here that you're seeing?
I feel like my experience with self-organizing and with Inspiral and just like, hey, maybe non-hierarchical things have got something in it. I feel like that culture is mirrored potentially in the Web3 space. Like there's a whole bunch of noise in Web3, and I've got so many friends who like just hate it and won't go near it, and just it's like that's just scammers and whatnot. And I find you have to dig to see the value when you're looking for really things. But I see a ton of value in it. And I think just the idea of imagine if the class of Web2 apps that grew up over the last 15 years had been community owned from the start. And if the people who used them had a stake in them and could influence them, like how different would the world, what different choices would have been made? I think it's really different when applications treat their communities like their shareholders rather than their, resources. And you're not mining them, you're sort of beholden to them. And I feel like we can build those types of systems, and that where the building blocks for that kind of world exist. And I also really think like nation states have got limitations, and we've got some massive global challenges, which I think come from the trade-offs from nation state organizing. And I don't think a lot of those trade-offs were consciously chosen, like I'm going to design a nation state, so let's do more of this and less of that. But I feel like they've emerged. And as the form of modern industrialized nation states has emerged and people make different choices in their policies and so on, that the space that they do as a design system has consequences. And I think some of those consequences are suboptimal. And that when I talk about heavy consensus mechanisms making root source claims to legitimacy, where you now trust what's there because of that consensus mechanism, I feel like there's some of the things which nation states currently do might move into that space or be shared with that space, or communities can now have governance and organize at scale without having to seek permission from governments and whatnot, as well as how do they get access to resources. So I just feel like there's this amazing possibility space which maybe can move quickly and maybe can apply resources and people and insights at scale, and can maybe out-cooperate the sort of the status quo, so we can make meaningful impacts on climate and biodiversity and just human civilization on this planet, etc. And so because I've been committed to using the tools of business from the beginning with Inspiral. And it's one of those, like other people make different choices, but for me, I felt like business could respond fast enough and adapt quickly enough to meet the needs. And if you look at what's happened with solar panels and so on and the impact that's had, like I think there is a case for business can be part of the solution. But it can't be unconstrained business, and I think we need to make different choices there. So copying the tools of business, copying some of the things from Web3 and other things, I reckon there's the possibility that movement could have a very meaningful impact. And it's just a possibility. It hasn't yet. I think it's still out, but I think it could. And I'd like to connect with the folks who are trying to do that and just help them go faster.
And it seems you use this word experiment a lot as part of your vocabulary, and that this like rapid learning, rapid experimentation. And what's informing that philosophy? Is it just a stylistic preference to work in that kind of 0 to 1 experimental phase, or is it also a theory of change that we need to let thousands of experiments and flowers bloom in order to kind of find the right evolutionary approach?
Both, I'd say. One, I think I love that stuff. Like to me, the idea of, oh, could we do this? Could we do that? Like when you're saying someone should write down my ideas, nope, don't. So many of them are garbage. It's like there's so many of them where I'm just like, oh no, that's not a good idea. But I think but that space, I love it. And also, and then to me, it's all about like, is that idea good enough to allocate energy to? And if so, then when? And like when you're talking about the 80,000 hours, I'm like, yeah, I might have 4 or 5 bets in me. If I'm lucky, if I get a full run, and if I manage my energy well, maybe I can have a couple of bites at different approaches to making impact. And I've done a couple of things in my career. I've learned a lot, got a lot of things, but I'm starting to think about, well, I've got some potential for more. What are they? And I'm trying to be very considered, and I'm trying to think a lot about what will I enjoy doing? Because if I don't enjoy it, I'm probably not going to succeed at it, etc. And that is, and also, if you start to look at the systems that are applied at scale in our world, and you extrapolate from where they're going, which is, again, a very difficult task, and I appreciate no one can just do it. But to me, I don't have confidence that will yield good outcomes. I feel like if we just keep doing what we're doing as a society, that we will start to see very poor outcomes. And maybe those are terrifying outcomes in terms of like the word collapse or things, or massive nation state conflict or whatnot. But human civilizations have collapsed before, and there's been signals about why, and there's people who've studied the whole thing, and I don't have confidence in our current system. And I feel like when you look at things just like the impact of money and finance and the way the world works, on the corporatization of the world, on the way governments work, on just the reactive positioning that's happening globally, etc., it's terrifying. And I don't think that if we just let it happen and just do the stuff which has worked at scale before, I just think it's like more likely to collapse than if we don't. I think we need quite radical thinking from the ground up about what does a truly sustainable and regenerative society look like on this planet. And even if we could figure that out as a blueprint, which is, I think, impossible, you'd have to see a lot of data points to have confidence in it. But then how do you get from where we are to there? Because maybe over there's no clean bridge, which is competitive along the whole thing. So, because I feel like we need to start building little mini experiments or bits of DNA or cultures or viruses or whatever they are, which outcompete the status quo and heal us in a good direction where we have more confidence that the trajectory we're on is a good one. And so that's the other reason why I'm just like, I think we need quite radical thinking.
Yeah, and I've always appreciated how you have an ecological and climate embedded lens into that impact. I remember seeing a presentation you gave in the early days of Dev Academy, and it was kind of like introduction to this course, and then you had like planetary boundaries and species extinction as like slide 2, like this is the context we're in, and like as a way to not say this is what everyone has to work on, but like just to ground us in this time and this epoch that we're in, and the risks that really pervade our system as it stands. Can you share any other thoughts about climate in general?
It seems like I've gone through phases. I did a lot of climate activism early on, and then I became very disillusioned around, will this work? And then, okay, I'll just start to build things and contribute. And some of the more people working on stuff that matters was like a punting. I don't know what's going to work, but hey, if you've got an idea that might work, I might help you out. Maybe it will work. And maybe it's just a very big hedge around how to spend my time because I don't have a better idea. So I think that one of the reflections, like it's been fascinating watching the New Zealand government's response in the wake of the cyclones. So billions of dollars of damage. It's the third biggest natural disaster in the country. And the immediate response afterward is we're going to cut our climate emissions subsidies and whatnot. $1 billion out of the climate budget because we want to win the next election. And if we have that in there, we're less likely to win it. And so it's just really embedded for me, this view that like I don't think governments will get us there. I feel like they are so reactive, and that so many people, when pushed, will not choose climate. They will choose cheaper or safer or more wealth or whatnot. And that even in the wake of the biggest, and it's, climate induced and so on, it's just madness to me there wasn't a double down. There wasn't a, yes, we're all going to do this. It's like, nope, we're going to push back our clean car subsidy. We're going to gut the emissions sort of things. And so I'm sort of sitting with that and thinking about that a bit. It's maybe a bit more disillusioned with the government process where it felt like they were kind of getting there. And then you sort of see, okay, well, solar panels and the price of them, that's probably the only thing I really have hope in, is just the industrialization and the reducing of price and just the swarm of people across broader society saying, how do we decarbonize this whole economy? And I think that work is, so I think we'll decarbonize, and I think it'll be too late. I think we'll have very heavy costs from it. So as I start to filter out, like one of the projects I'm considering, I'm calling like Open Microfactory, which is basically how do I turn my shed into a small scale manufacturing plant? So that I can do, like, how can one person run it, and how can I use like hobbyist level robotics to do runs of timber or metal or glass or food preservation? Or could I make my own solar panels? Could I make my own supercapacitors? What would be involved in that level of tech? And one, it's just I like making, and it's a hobby and so on. I don't know if it's got legs as a real project, but I just keep coming down to it partly from I think we're going to see hundreds of millions of people displaced. I think we're going to see whole societies really pushed from the adaptation. And as people start doing managed retreat from sort of not just coastlines, but like where the rivers are going to flood and where the landslips are going to happen all around the country. And as we see like food production shift because of climate patterns, I think we're going to see a level of disruption that no one can really emotionally get at the moment. And I think the people who do emotionally get it, it's dark.
So what do we do, Josh? I mean, how are you, if governments aren't going to get us there, and business as usual or the tools of business as usual aren't going to get us there, it seems like we're exploring these coordination mechanisms and new opportunities to use things like decentralized technologies, and things like distributed manufacturing may also play a key role. Other thoughts, and I'm particularly curious about how do we fund the kind of work that needs to happen, whether you believe it's at the bioregion or local scale, or if it's just more socially impactful organization scale, or how are you sensing the patterns right now around new projects and initiatives finding the resources they need to respond to this polycrisis, metacrisis time that we live in?
I think a lot of it's like searching out the signal from the noise. And like why I'm so interested in your podcast is like, I just want to watch this thing. I want to see all the people you've been talking to, and I want to tune into their work so I can figure out who I can jump in and just contribute to things on. And so I feel like there's a couple of things which I'm using as my keystones. One is I kind of think that open and transparent is more important than decentralized. And I think the web and decentralized and so on, like there's a lot of things that like, yes, we should decentralize stuff.
Yeah.
But also, I don't think it's an end to a means. I don't think it's a means unto an end. I don't think it's whatever. We should. It's not the thing. It's not the goal. Right. We decentralize because of what it gives us, not because we should by blindness. Whereas I kind of feel like I'm more interested in open and transparent organizations and processes and open source. And one of the reasons for the Microfactory is like there's this whole world of open source hardware, and it's got higher table stakes than open source software is. You've got a laptop, you can do the software, but you kind of need machines and stuff to do the open source. And I want to play in that space. I want to contribute and engage in that. So I kind of need machines and tools and whatnot to do it. And so open for me is a real guiding light, is anyone who's building like open protocols, open things where people can join in and swarm, because I think they have the potential to scale fast enough. If you've got a permissionless protocol and anyone can start to regenerate by joining the protocol or whatnot, well, it can scale. It's not as gated and whatnot. And you need to, it's challenging to design permissionless things because, it can turn into chaos pretty quick. And how do you ensure the integrity of your system and whatnot? So it's not easy, but it's interesting. And so I kind of feel like open and permissionless is one of my guiding lights of where I look at. And I also think that there's something just around consciously mitigating the externalities. How is it that this thing is going to generate true value? And this goes back to like, I think it was like influences on Inspiral, like Umair Haque and the New Capitalist Manifesto, and the thin value versus thick value just framed my reference for how to operate. Was like, how many businesses make a profit, but they haven't generated value? They've just captured value from someone else. And it felt to me that so many industries and so many corporations were just pirates extracting value rather than creating value. And for me, the premise of a business is you take inputs A and inputs B and you combine them to an output C, and you've created more value than you've consumed. And that's only true if you consciously manage externalities. And that's the role of government sometimes, but don't do a great job of it. So when I'm looking at things, I'm like, what are the externalities here? And it's like, you see all the debates in AI at the moment of like, cool, yeah, you've just mined the internet and you've captured all these people and embodied it in a model. Is that fair or is that not? And that's somewhat interesting. But I think it's more about the ongoing externalities of it. What are the consequences of this thing rolling out? Who is cleaning up after it? Who is subsidizing its inputs is the other thing I look at. So open and engaging externalities. And the other one for me is like, will people use it? Is it viable? Like I think so much stuff is just like get in the hands of real users and real people, solve real problems rather than build building blocks for other people to assemble into problems. Which was, I think it was fine for a phase, but I think that phase is over. And so I'm kind of only interested in people and projects where they're like, yeah, people can use this and they will use it for reasons. And so there's this possibility space, which I think is threading needles again. Using Web3 for real world products, like I see a lot of people with that impetus. And how do they actually use these and how do they outcompete other solutions for it? So I know that's sort of what I'm using as a personal heuristic, but hey, I'd like to see your podcast and I'd like you to, people like you to do more work of just like synthesizing that and saying, hey, pay attention to these things.
Amazing. Well, are there any other questions that I didn't ask or key messages that you'd be interested in sharing?
I'd just say that I think when I've encountered people who are just really like they're driven, they're all in on their project, it takes that to do stuff. Like you can understand the all in you need in a way. I think it's really important that people look after themselves on that journey and that it's more important that you go again than you go once in my mind. I think it's more important that people have the wherewithal to basically continue a career as a change maker or whatnot, even if that's got phases of activity and some things are super intense and need to be even, etc. So I think about that for all the founders out there. It's like how they look after themselves. One of the biggest things I've learned and why I'm so grateful for the Inspiral experience is that we look after ourselves by being in community with each other. And it's not just about going to an event and a conference and so on, or having like fragments or momentary parts of community. I think it's about by having long-lasting and deep community where we really have each other's backs. And we show up for the hard parts in each other's sort of careers, whether that's like get the funding they need or a difficult restructure or whatnot. And it's the moments when I've seen my colleagues do that for each other inside Inspiral and outside of it that I've seen like the real resilience of that sort of work, because it's hard and I think it's really important. So I'd say like find community, be in community. It's not free. It's like if you're in true community, it takes investment, it takes skill, it takes learning, it takes humility. But when you start to give meaningful help to your colleagues and they give meaningful help to you, I think we unlock value. I think we unlock capacity, and it's a truly generative experience. And it also makes it more likely that we'll all be able to keep doing this work for as long as we need to. So that'd be the main thing. I'd just say, hey, find that, make it. It's wonderful. And I think that it's if we just all did that, maybe that's enough. And this is where I think about the ripples of our work in a way. Like it's easy to. Some projects have very direct outcomes, and you can point to them and you can claim them and so on. And I think there's a fallacy of claiming those outcomes as our personal thing. In reality, it's like we didn't invent the internet. We didn't there's so much stuff which we're just doing the icing on the cake, even if we're doing very direct work. And I think that a lot of the true value is probably in the indirect work it's like, how do you, if we can just give up the outputs of our work and the surrender to it and just like, it'll be what it'll be. Let's just do work we love and make the best calls we can. Then I feel like there's a possibility space there, which is interesting to me.
Well, Josh, you are one of the smartest and most humble people I know. I'm forever grateful for the impact you've had on my journey. Thanks for sharing your time and thoughts with us today. We'll include links in the show notes to the different projects and pieces of work that you've mentioned here today. And I'm sure that listeners are going to really appreciate everything that you shared. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. And just keep up the work. I'm really excited to see what you're producing.
Cool. That was a lot of fun. It was so awesome to have Josh. I really appreciate his humility and brilliance. To learn more, go to inspiral.com. You can also check out devacademy.co.nz. Links are in the show notes. And you might also be interested in conversations we've had with others around the Inspiral and New Zealand community, including Chelsea Robinson, Derek Razzo, Yosef Ayeli, and Songi Lee. You can find all of those conversations and more at maearth.com. That's maearth.com. Please like, share, subscribe, leave a comment. We'd love to engage with you further in our community Discord. We are a new interview series and channel, so your feedback is deeply appreciated. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you on the next one.